Times was looking into the lies of the Vietnam War and so on. It had an active view that the government doesn't tell the truth. So you go out to find out what the truth is. Now the New York Times is like, suck your thumb. Don't ask anything. Don't ask any question. Don't be curious. We don't know who blew up the pipeline. I'll give another example. Ukraine has been shelling the Zaporizhia nuclear power plant. Well, maybe it's understandable. They want the power plant back. Russia grabbed the power plant. But it's dangerous to shell a nuclear power plant. In fact, it's reckless to shell a nuclear power plant. So we should be saying to our ally, Ukraine, don't shell a nuclear power plant. Instead, the New York Times says almost every day, each side accuses the other of shelling the nuclear power plant. Well, I can tell you and I can tell your listeners, because I'm well briefed on it, that Ukraine is shelling the nuclear power plant. Oh, but we're not allowed to say that. Excuse me. We can't say that. So this is the problem, Katie. So you asked me how I feel about it. I feel about it that we should tell the truth, because actually the world's really complicated. It's really in trouble, and grown-ups should behave like grown-ups. That's my bottom line.
And there are some interesting recent examples of you telling the truth and the response to you when you tell the truth. Hold on, let's see. So this is you on Bloomberg television.
I remember the moment.
I'm sure. I'm sure it's seared in your memory.
The destruction of the Nord Stream pipeline, which I would bet was a U.S. action, perhaps U.S. and Poland. This is
Jeff, we got to stop there. That's quite a statement as well. Why do you feel that was a U.S. action? What evidence do you have of that?
Well, first of all, there's direct radar evidence that U.S. helicopters, military helicopters that are normally based in Gdansk, were circling over this area. We also had the threats from the United States earlier in this year that one way or another, we are going to end Nord Stream. We also have a remarkable statement by Secretary Blinken last Friday in a press conference. He says, this is also a tremendous opportunity. It's a strange way to talk if you're worried about the piracy on international infrastructure of vital significance. So I know this runs counter to our narrative. You're not allowed to say these things in the West. But the fact of the matter is, all over the world, when I talk to people, they think the U.S. did it. Just to tell you. And by the way, even reporters on our papers that are involved tell me privately, of course, but it doesn't show up in our media.
Professor, I want to get into tit for tat about what did or did not.
So that was an interesting response.
Well, it was a little bit of a funny moment because, usually I'm on that. I'll probably never be on that show again, but I've been on that show many times, and usually they have me on for, 2 or 3 of the segments, maybe up to half an hour. And after that, I was off. And then when I was off, one of the anchors, not the 2 that you saw, but the third one, went after me for 5 minutes. They didn't cut off my camera so I could watch on my Zoom. And he just, ad hominem attack for 5 minutes. And, of course, I wasn't around to speak about
Respond to it, right.
But this is a problem that it's a game of narratives right now. And we don't need games. We actually need real discussion of very serious issues before we blow ourselves up by mistake or just blunder or misinformation or so many other possibilities.
Right. And here's another example of you saying something that people seem a bit uncomfortable with. And this is from the Athens Democracy Forum in October.
Yes.
Just playing some of your greatest hits here.
The most violent country in the world in the 19th century, by far, was perhaps the most democratic or second most democratic, and that was Britain. You can be democratic at home and ruthlessly imperial abroad. The most violent country in the world since 1950 has been the United States. It's been by far involved
Jeffrey,
in more,
stop
wait a
now.
minute, in more
Let's
wars.
Jeffrey. Jeffrey. I'm your moderator, and it's enough.
Okay, I'm done.
That was another interesting moment. They didn't seem very comfortable with what you were saying.
Yeah, the truth is I had talked on a long time, so I probably
okay.
talked too long, but also I should have been allowed to finish the thought.
Right.
It was actually a real and serious point that I was making, which is that all my life the U.S. has been in wars, and wars of choice, and wars that have gone badly, and wars that have inflicted incredible harm on other people and damage to the U.S. and costing trillions of dollars. And we should acknowledge that and understand this. It's a little hard because some of this is so completely underreported. You might think wars would have to be reported. But one example that I know quite a bit about is Syria. We say that Syria had a civil war, or that it had a rebellion against Assad in 2011. But what Americans never heard about was the presidential finding by Obama that the CIA should work together with the other countries in the Middle East to overthrow Assad. In other words, this was a regime change operation. And I think regime change operations are awful. We shouldn't be doing them. They are incredibly destructive and filled with lies, especially when they're covert, as this one was. And we never discussed the U.S. role in this. Everything was basically the lie that there's an insurrection and we're helping the freedom fighters, not that the United States is actively trying to overthrow a government. And is that right, or is that wrong? Is that a decent idea? And one of the things that Putin sees is that the U.S. does that a lot. It shouldn't be a secret, but it's not well understood. Of course, we overthrew Saddam Hussein. We tried to overthrow Assad and failed. We overthrew and basically led to the murder of Muammar Gaddafi. We overthrew the Afghan government. But even more than that, what Americans really don't know and should know is that in 1979, it was the CIA that funded the Mujahideen, which was the precursor of Al-Qaeda and Osama bin Laden and all of that. We did that as a lure to try to draw the Soviet Union into a war in Afghanistan. Really a deep, dirty trick that now not only ended up destroying Afghanistan over the course of many decades, but drew the United States into this complete morass for 40 years as well. And then Putin says, I don't want NATO on my border. And the United States says, oh, why? Don't be paranoid. We're a defensive, peace-loving country. When you know a bit, you just say, don't put NATO on Russia's border. That's what you know. And if the New York Times were doing its job, which it doesn't do anymore, and if the Washington Post were doing its job, which it doesn't do anymore, and it was giving some context, some background, some history to fill out what these conflicts are about, we wouldn't be stuck in these conflicts.
I would say we don't know what the options are because there has been no diplomacy between the United States and Russia since this war began. As far as I know, President Biden and President Putin have not spoken one time since February 24th, 2022. I find that worse than school children, by the way. It's hard for me to understand how the world can be at the brink of nuclear war. And I could send them a link if they want so they could get on Zoom. I could even give them a phone call. I'd lend them my phone. It's not so hard. But they don't talk. This is somehow sophisticated. This is absolutely mind-boggling. Of course, you need to talk. You need to understand the other side. Maybe you won't agree. More likely, you'll find a modus vivendi or a modus operandi to get beyond this. It could be, in the end, many things could be. So I don't have a prediction. Ukraine could be divided. We could have nuclear war. We could have Ukraine be neutral and Russia go home from most of Ukraine, though I don't think it's going to leave Crimea for a lot of reasons now. But lots of things could happen. We should understand that in December 2021, the idea that Russia would annex the Donbass wasn't mentioned once. What Russia wanted was that the Minsk II agreements would be honored. Now, that's quite interesting. The Minsk II agreements declared that there would be autonomy for the Lugansk and Donetsk, for eastern Ukraine, the Russian dominant ethnic group, signed by Ukraine and voted 15-0 by the UN Security Council and guaranteed by France and Germany. You know what my Ukrainian friends, well, they don't regard me as a friend anymore, but what they tell me? Of course we'd never honor that, as if it's a joke. And then when Russia says, well, this was not honored, we say, what difference? Russia doesn't believe in diplomacy. And now the sentence that I just uttered proves that I'm a Putin lover. You know, in other words, we're in a cycle of bizarre arguments. The truth is actually rather straightforward. The United States participated in the overthrow of Yanukovych. A Russophobic government came to power. They immediately declared the intention, immediately means within 2014, to join NATO. Arms shipments from the United States accelerated. The Minsk agreements were signed. The Ukrainian government ignored them. Chancellor Merkel explained afterwards, she explained to us last year that she ignored them completely. In 2021, December 17, President Putin put on the table a draft U.S.-Russia security agreement, which had two major points that Putin was emphasizing. One is that the Minsk agreement should be carried out. And the second was that NATO would not enlarge. And the United States said, we don't negotiate with you over those things. And it's NATO doctrine. What we do is no third country's business. As if Castro said, what business is it of you, United States, just before we invaded in the Bay of Pigs and also nearly had the world blown up over the Cuban Missile Crisis. If the tables are turned just a little bit, believe me, the explosion that you would hear of any of the claims that the United States makes. So that kind of hypocrisy and arrogance also is very grating on most of the rest of the world. We make wars when we want. We can invade Afghanistan. We can invade Iraq. We can try to overthrow Assad, and have no doubt that was not a civil war. That was a U.S. regime change operation signed by the President of the United States to the CIA called Operation Timber Sycamore. We can overthrow Gaddafi with the NATO in the end of 2011. We can overthrow Yanukovych. We can do what we want. Why are you complaining? We are a peace-loving defensive alliance. And so this doesn't work. And this is why we don't know what can happen, because I keep claiming, I'll claim it again, President Biden did what a US president should do. First picked up the phone or hit the Zoom button and talked to his counterpart and said, you go home and we won't fill in the void with NATO. Lots of good things could happen. So I don't rule out anything, but it takes two to make a negotiation. Incidentally, one more point, sorry to run on. In March 2022, Russia and Ukraine negotiated an end to the war. Did you know that? They negotiated. What happened? What happened? Excuse me? No, that's not what happened. Okay, Bucha may or may not have happened, but that's not what happened at the negotiating table. What happened at the negotiating table was the United States told them, don't negotiate. That's what the United States told them. This is now from multiple directions clear. And if you want to hear a very interesting description of this that shows how bizarre this is, Naftali Bennett, who was then Prime Minister of Israel and an informal mediator, said we were in the seventh draft and they were just about reaching an agreement. And then the United States stopped it. And he said, I don't think they should have stopped it, but they thought it was important about China. Are you kidding? It takes a certain imagination to think that way. But that's what happened. And I've heard that from all sides. So this is really not beyond our reach to have a negotiated outcome to this. Not at all beyond our reach.
Let me push a little bit on this.
We have played a huge contribution, going all the way back to the time when you were in Moscow. You've already discussed the fact that you weren't getting the support then from the US government that you needed in order to do the kind of things that could have been done, which might have consolidated peace then and changed the political situation. And of course, there's no recognition of that today, none at all. I mean, everything that happened at that time isn't discussed, and the enlargement of NATO isn't discussed. And it's almost heresy to suggest that it had any contribution, had any role in the start of the war at all. You want to say anything quickly about that before we...
Yeah, I just want to say that, one of the biggest problems, and it's pervasive, is the US government lies about everything and lies relentlessly. It's not the only one. British government does the same and other governments do the same, but the lying is non-stop. So we don't really even know, except by trying to parse the, whatever evidence or crumbs or leaks or whistleblowers tell us what's really going on, what is going on. But what we do know now is how America's top diplomats for 30 years warned against the American policy approach. And one of the most important warnings that everyone can find online is a memo by our current CIA director, William Burns, who in 2008 was the US ambassador to Russia. And he wrote a memo called Niet means Niet. And it was, that is a red line to extend NATO to Ukraine. And he said, it's not just Putin, it's the entire political class. It doesn't matter, pro-Putin, anti-Putin, all Russian leaders say Niet means Niet. Now, the reason I mentioned secrecy in this context, we never even know about this except for WikiLeaks. Because the American people, who should tell the American people what our
top diplomat in Russia thinks about the most crucial issue that could get us all killed. The American people, they're completely incidental to this story. No one tells them anything, and no one admits anything. And so there's been so much lying about the failure of negotiations. Why did the negotiations break down in March 2022? Because the U.S. stopped Ukraine from agreeing with Russia on neutrality. How do we know that? Because I know it because people have told me that were involved in the negotiations, but I also know it because Naftali Bennett, who was an informal mediator, happened to blurt it out in an interview, which is quite fascinating to look at because it's a little weird how just open he talks. He says, yeah, we were reaching an agreement. We were in the 7th draft. They were about to sign. Then the United States came in and stopped it. And by the way, you know why he says they stopped it? Because, well, I disagreed, Bennett says, but, they wanted to look tough to China. Are you kidding? This is a war not even about Ukraine. It's about China, and not even about China, but about looking tough to China. And by the way, Stoltenberg, who really is someone I've known for a long time, and he is I can't even say it publicly anymore, what I think about him, even though I used to be friends with him when he was Prime Minister of Norway. Disgusting. But today he says, we can't look soft because China will see us looking soft. This is the way to get us all killed, by the way. But I want to come back to the secrecy point. We wouldn't know what these diplomats said, except that they get leaked or they get released, or once in a while, one of them reflects after the fact in their memoirs how dangerous the time was. William Perry tells us afterwards, I thought about resigning because of NATO enlargement. I was so much against it. It was so dangerous. But then I thought maybe I shouldn't resign and so forth. He's a wonderful man. He should have resigned. The public should have understood this much earlier. But these things are not told. And we never got an accounting of why the negotiations broke down in March 2022. So the mainstream media just go completely silent. They don't even ask a question. And it's this secrecy which allows a small group, Biden, Newland, Blinken, Sullivan, I'm sure, obviously Raytheon and others are happy in the military-industrial complex and the Armed Services Committee, they're happy. But it's a tiny group that is calling these policies. And these are crazy policies, and they're absolutely dangerous. And I think the Cuban Missile Crisis, to come back to that, taught us, most of the opinion of these elites, which was always pointing to war solutions, would have gotten us all killed. And that's why it's so crazy that we're in the situation we're in right now. One mild saving grace is that all the European pro-war leaders are unpopular and becoming more and more unpopular, and Biden is very unpopular. So none of this is winning any political support. And if they actually took the issue to the people in our countries, the public would be dead set against what we're doing right now, because we're gambling with Armageddon, to quote a title of a wonderful book about the Cuban Missile Crisis, for no reason, because we could have reached peace in December 2021 when Putin put absolutely valid, real propositions on the table that should have been negotiated. The U.S. rejected that. We could have reached peace in March 2022 when they came close to signing an agreement that the United States stopped, and we could reach peace now, even now. But they don't want to negotiate.
Because this is the problem. They don't want to negotiate, and then by not making negotiations possible now, it seems to me that they're making negotiations more difficult in the future.
Of course, everything gets harder. Everything gets harder. And in 2021, in December 17, when President Putin put the U.S.-Russia security agreement on the table, there was no talk, by the way, about territory at that time or about annexation of Lugansk and Donetsk and so forth. This was about the Minsk II agreement. An agreement that was reached, not only signed by Ukraine, but actually endorsed 15-0 by the UN Security Council. And more than that, guaranteed, quote unquote, by France and Germany. I believe the war started 9 years ago, not last year. I think it started in February 2014. It started with the violent overthrow of President Yanukovych, which I attribute to a significant extent to U.S. Participation in a regime change operation in Ukraine. And to my mind, that really was the trigger of this war, meaning that we are basically seeing a proxy war between the United States and Russia, plus both sides playing on the very aggravated ethnic divisions within Ukraine. So Ukraine is a divided country, ethnically, historically, but that meant that there was competition between the United States and Russia for control, for influence, even for putting military bases and the US-NATO alliance. And I view the lack of prudence by both sides, but since I'm an American, I will focus on the lack of American prudence as being absolutely central to this. If the United States had sense, and by the United States, I don't mean the American people, they're never asked about any of these things. This has nothing to do with the American people. This is to do with a small group in Washington, in power. You could call it the military-industrial complex. It's a fair name for it. They don't have prudence, and we are at war because of that lack of prudence, in my view. I don't think anything specific about Putin's personality plays any important role in this. I don't think that this is some idea of recreating the Russian Empire. By the way, we hear lots of things in the mainstream media, which to my mind are completely unrecognizable regarding the truth. And just one more small point. I was economic advisor to President Gorbachev. I was economic advisor to President Yeltsin. And I was an economic advisor to President Kuchma, the first president of independent Ukraine. I didn't choose sides. I like them both. There's no reason why this war needed to happen, but I'll focus, because of being an American, on the lack of sense of the military-industrial complex in the United States. And I think that that was a major, major cause of this war.
You said personality doesn't really play that role. So you mentioned NATO and probably you said structural causes and hegemonic competition. And of course, Russia's perception is that Russia wanted to wall off NATO. So he was not really successful, because now NATO is everywhere. So NATO, Finland and Sweden are joining NATO, and NATO troops are permanently deployed in Poland and the Baltic states. Right now, we have a huge NATO military maneuver in Germany, and also Putin wanted to demilitarize Ukraine, and now Ukraine is the most militarized country in Europe. Was Putin's decision a big geopolitical blunder?
Well, it's a big geopolitical tragedy. What happens from now still remains to be seen. And let me be clear about the NATO issues. It's my, it's without doubt the American plan to expand NATO to Ukraine already in the mid-1990s, well before there was Putin as president. it is my understanding from a discussion with one of our leading historians recently that the plan to expand NATO to Ukraine was made in 1992, basically within weeks or months of having promised Gorbachev that NATO would not move 1 inch eastward. So this is not something new. It's not something about Putin. It's something that predates Putin. There's a fascinating article by Zbigniew Brzezinski in Foreign Affairs magazine, which is our establishment foreign policy magazine, in 1997, where he spells out the timeline to NATO enlargement to Central Europe, Eastern Europe, the Baltic states, and Ukraine almost precisely in 1997, because this was a U.S. plan at the top levels. When an article is written like that, that's not just an opinion of an author, that's informing the elite opinion in the United States what the real plan is. So this was in the works for decades. And the specific idea about NATO, spelled out by Brzezinski both in Foreign Affairs and in a book called The Global Chessboard that he wrote in 1997, is to surround Russia in the Black Sea region. This is out of the playbook of Britain and France in 1853 to 1856. It's almost reliving the Crimean War. The idea of the Crimean War was that Palmerston wanted to kick Russia out of the Black Sea. Brzezinski had a similar idea in the mid-1990s. The US neoconservatives had a similar idea back to 1992. If Ukraine and Georgia become NATO members, then if you look at the map, you see that Russia is surrounded by Ukraine, Romania, Bulgaria, Turkey, and Georgia. Even the idea of expanding NATO to Georgia, to me, is the giveaway. Last time I checked, Georgia is not a North Atlantic country. It's in the Caucasus. What in heaven's name is... W. Bush Jr. added 7 more countries, 3 in the Baltics, so 3 right on Russia's border, Bulgaria and Romania, which is Russia's Black Sea region, and Slovakia and Slovenia. And we continue NATO expansion. And in 2008, Bush said, now we'll go to Ukraine and to Georgia. And to my mind, this was just absolutely the most provocative thing we could do. Because now we're pushing NATO right up against Russia's core security concerns. And the Europeans, many European leaders told me in 2008 how dangerous this was and how much they were against it, but the US calls the shots. So, ladies and gentlemen, to my mind, we've been stirring the pot the whole time. And there are many complications to this story, so I could talk for hours about the details. But in 2014, the pro-Russian president was overthrown. The US narrative is it was a mass public upheaval against a corrupt president. And I was there on the ground soon afterwards, and I know that the US played a direct role in the overthrow. And the Russians call it a coup. So we have competing narratives, but the Russians say, look, you overthrew the president friendly to our country. We don't want you anywhere close to our borders. At the end of 2021, Putin put forward security demands to the White House. At the core of them was, don't expand NATO. I called the White House at the end of 2021 to beg them, negotiate. We shouldn't be expanding NATO anyway. Negotiate. And I was told, no, we have an open door policy.
which means that anyone that wants to join NATO can join NATO. And I said, that's crazy. This isn't a right. This is a threat to another country. This isn't about rights. This is about the effects on the neighbors. And I said, do you believe that Mexico has the right to have a military alliance with China? I don't think so. But that's what you say about Ukraine, that they have the right to have a military alliance with the United States. I said, in any event, they can ask, but it's not prudent for us to do it. Well, the White House refused any negotiations. And then there are competing stories, and I won't go into all the details, but Putin invaded on February 24th, and we've been escalating ever since. And the last week has been filled with news stories, these casual stories of will he or won't he use nuclear weapons, as if, we're trying to predict the outcome of the Super Bowl. It's bizarre to me. I've just never seen anything so reckless. And I have no confidence in the U.S. government, no confidence in what we're doing to head this off, because they're dead set on doing whatever it takes. That's what they say all the time, whatever it takes to win this, for Ukraine to win this war. And since I don't think Russia's going to lose this war, short of nuclear war, to my mind, we're on a recipe of continued escalation. And I'll stop with the reading. I want to read you one set of words from my favorite speech of modern times by an American president, which is President John F. Kennedy's speech on June 10, 1963. And just to give background about this, I wrote a book about this speech because I love it so much. After the Cuban Missile Crisis, Kennedy and Khrushchev knew the world's insane. We can't go on this way. We're going to blow everything up. We need to find a way to peace. And Kennedy gave this speech on June 10, 1963, to convince Americans that it was possible to make peace with the Soviet Union, which was not a conventional view. How can you make peace with the commies? And Kennedy said, we have to check our own attitudes. They're human beings. They have the same desires as we do, and they want to live in peace also. And so if the agreement is mutually satisfactory, it can be mutually observed. Very, very wise words by President Kennedy. And the whole speech is completely wonderful. And I've driven my family crazy for years by making them listen to it on multiple occasions, especially when I was writing the book. They had to listen to it 10 times at least. But in any event, Kennedy said something that I really, really want to emphasize. He said, and it's the most important statement for this moment. He said, above all, while defending our own vital interests, nuclear powers must avert those confrontations which bring an adversary to a choice of either a humiliating retreat or a nuclear war. To adopt that kind of course in the nuclear age would be evidence only of the bankruptcy of our policy or of a collective death wish for the world. So what Kennedy is saying is, you never, with a nuclear adversary, make them choose between a humiliating defeat and a nuclear war. But that's exactly what we're proposing to do right now with Putin. Not only that, every day Zelensky tries to humiliate Putin, not tries to solve a problem, but to humiliate Putin. Maybe, of course, he's rallying his supporters, but we get closer and closer to the precipice. I can't stand listening to Zelensky, I'm telling you, because maybe I can understand, although I don't really understand. If I were next door to Russia, I'd have a different language, because I wouldn't want to be nuked either. But what he's doing in terms of provocation is extremely dangerous, and we're playing the game because we're saying whatever they do, that's all right. They have to win. I believe that they're the ones shelling the nuclear power plant. I'm absolutely almost sure
that it's Ukraine shelling the power plant. Our papers say we don't know who's doing it, but since Russia controls the plant and Ukraine wants to win it back, I think Ukraine is shelling the nuclear power plant. I think, by the way, just to add to the discussion, that we are the ones that blew up the Nord Stream pipeline. I'm pretty sure that was a U.S. action. When I said it on television a couple of days ago, they took me off the air immediately because you're not allowed to say this on U.S. television. But it's pretty much conventional wisdom in other parts of the world, even by reporters that don't write it in their paper. If you talk to them privately, they say, of course it's the U.S. Who else would do it? Who else could do it? Who else had an incentive to do it? So let me stop there. It's so dangerous. We have no debate in this country, in Congress or any place else. They're not asking us to be part of this discussion, even though it's our lives on the line and our children's lives and our grandchildren's lives. New York City is extraordinarily vulnerable, I don't have to mention. And our congressmen aren't saying boo. So one thing I'd love for us to do is reach the New York delegation to just say, this is reckless. Stop it. We're in the 60th anniversary of the Cuban Missile Crisis this month. We don't want to replay it. And we would never have survived it had it not been for Kennedy in that position, because if it had been any of his advisors, the world would have been destroyed. But he was smart enough not to destroy the world. So let me stop there and turn it over and open for discussion. Thanks a lot.
And why is it that the United States was so provocative, has been so provocative towards Russia?
You know, because after the end of the Soviet Union, we thought, hey, we're pretty good. We're the sole superpower. We're the most powerful country on the planet by far in world history. We can do pretty much what we want. And that really was the view in both political parties. So it's not really a partisan thing. It is what we call a neoconservative thing. It was the idea that, hey, we can whoop who we want when we want, whether it's Saddam Hussein or Muammar Gaddafi. We can stick it to Vladimir Putin. We are the United States of America. And we acted on that. We had, remember, Cheney and Rumsfeld and that crowd? Well, we have them in both parties. We have Victoria Nuland in this administration, who was out there helping to overthrow a pro-Russian president of Ukraine in 2014, and now she's the Undersecretary of State for Political Affairs. So we have these neocons who say, compromise? Are you kidding? We're the United States. And since we think we're so powerful, well, we're in Afghanistan. That's great. Syria, Iraq, Libya, Ukraine. Oh, so successful. And I say, are you kidding? My whole life, I was born a long time ago in 1954. I grew up in the Vietnam War period, and it wasn't just Vietnam. It was Cambodia, Laos, Vietnam. I went through the Contras in Nicaragua. I went through Afghanistan, the first Iraq War, the second Iraq War, the CIA operation to overthrow Bashar al-Assad, the NATO operation to overthrow Muammar Gaddafi. Now the U.S. role in overthrowing Viktor Yanukovych, the pro-Russian Ukrainian president in 2014, this expansion of NATO being tried right now. I just think, yeah, we're powerful, but is this really good for the United States? Is this really working? And my answer is no, it's not working well. And most of all, when Putin said last year, look, the red line is don't expand NATO. And immediately the White House said, oh, no one tells us what to do, least of all Russia. And I called the White House and I said, you should listen. Do not put Ukraine into this situation. You will make Ukraine the Afghanistan of Europe. And by that, I mean a perpetual war and leveling these cities in Ukraine, as we're watching right now, and millions of people without heat and electricity. And we say, yeah, we're winning. come on, we're not winning. This is not the right way to behave.
And who did you speak to at the White House, and how was it received?
It was not well received, and I didn't make any headway.
Right. Was it? I mean, did you speak to Biden himself?
No.
No. Okay. You spoke to.
I spoke to advisors.
Yeah. You're someone who has a lot of access, and although it's probably been changing because you've been saying things that are considered heretical.
They don't love what I'm saying. Let's put it that way. I don't know whether, I mean, they still hear me.
Right.
So it's pretty much one way.
Right. Yeah. I was going to say, I mean, do you think that you've changed your politics or your view of the world? You've had such a long and prolific career, and you're very well respected and established. And it almost shocks me that someone of your stature says things that are outside of the mainstream as you do. I mean that as a compliment. Is this something you've always had, or is this a newer thing?
Well, it grew over time because when I started my career, which was 1980, I got my PhD and I became an assistant professor at Harvard University. I can tell you, because I remember it, how proud I was to be an American economist in the world. I studied international economics, so I was going to go out and solve international problems as an American. And I thought that was pretty cool. My hero intellectually is a well-known, very famous British economist of the 20th century, John Maynard Keynes. And Keynes, I was very deeply influenced, like many in my generation. But I read a lot of Keynes's essays, and I just loved the guy, how intelligent and smart he was and decent. And he, at the time, was, an economist when Britain was with such power and influence. And I thought, that was interesting because he could get something done that was quite good. And I felt really proud that, I'm lucky to be an American at this time when America has this ability to help solve global problems. And here I am starting my career, and I'm going to help solve global problems as an American economist. And I felt that way for a number of years. But then I saw more and more that I didn't really like. And for me, a big turning point is when I became an advisor, always, by the way, unpaid. I don't do this commercially. I do this as a public intellectual, so-called, or as an academic. But I became an advisor to Mikhail Gorbachev's economic team, and then I became an advisor to Boris Yeltsin's economic team. And I knew, really from Keynes, by the way, that when the country that you're trying to help is in really, really deep financial crisis, after all, the whole system had completely collapsed, then that country needs some help to get back on its feet. And that was really my main message in 1990, 1991, 1992. And I helped Poland get back on its feet economically. And everything I recommended, by the way, the White House adopted almost right away. And I said, oh, God, good. They're listening to every word. And then I said the same thing about the Soviet Union with Gorbachev. Zero. Sachs, are you crazy? We're not going to help the Soviet Union. They're our enemy. And then when Soviet Union ended and Yeltsin's economic team asked me to help, I said the same thing about Russia. Again, zero. I thought that's pretty weird because what I'm recommending for Russia is exactly what I recommended for Poland. And it worked for Poland, and the White House supported what I recommended for Poland. But in the same conditions, it doesn't do it for Russia. I was a little naive, I have to say, because as an economist, I was making economic recommendations, how to help. But I don't think the mood of Rumsfeld and Cheney and others in 1992 was to help. It was, hey, we are the sole world superpower. We get to change everything right now. And then I waited with Clinton coming in, no real change. And then on, and I began to see that and understand better, quite frankly, as you grow up in this, because I've really worked all over the world and quite extensively in well over 100 countries. I've visited most of the world and know most of the world leaders one way or another, or many, many of them. And I came to understand that the U.S. was a little bit unhinged, and that the disasters of the Vietnam War era, which I knew full well because I had marched in the streets against the Vietnam War, and Watergate and the abuses, the Contra wars in Central America, and I also worked in Central America in those years. Those were not simply aberrations. Those were part of the design set, and you become more sophisticated. You see a lot of lying that is lying, because as I, have become much more, for 20 years, I've been a senior advisor to the United Nations on many things. I see a lot. I hear a lot. And I don't like it when we're not telling the truth. And I find it quite dangerous, and I don't like the spin and the narratives, and I don't like wars that are fought as narratives. I don't like it when we say, and for some reason, our mainstream media repeat, well, this war was an unprovoked war that started February 24th, 2022. No. There were lots of provocations, and I know some of them firsthand, and I know many, many of them by things that leaders have told me in detail, and I understand the provocations. Or today, there's a New York Times story about how the Germans connived, let's put it that way, to build the Nord Stream 2 pipeline with Russia. And because they wanted natural gas from Russia. The United States opposed that. And I've been saying for months, well, who blew up that pipeline? That would almost surely be the United States. If someone has some other evidence, show me. But otherwise, I know a lot of motivation and capacity that the U.S. did it. And President Biden on February 7th of this year said, if Russia invades, the Nord Stream pipeline is finished. And then the incredulous reporter said, but Mr. President, that's a Russian-German pipeline. And the president responded, believe me, we have our ways. And so today in the New York Times, they talk about Germany and Russia building the pipeline against U.S. opposition. But then when it comes to the paragraph, the short message about the destruction, they say nobody knows who did it. Come on. If you're the New York Times, when I was growing up, the New York Times was looking into Watergate.
It's quite exceptional for a president to make such a statement. So what are your thoughts on these issues?
American foreign policy is based on the idea of what they technically call full spectrum dominance of the United States in all regions of the world, meaning that our foreign policy doctrine is the United States needs to be the dominant power in Asia, in Europe, in every place in the world, with no challenge, no competitor, no rival. Another term for it is hegemony. This is not a secret. If you live like I do in East Coast universities, teaching at Harvard for tenured professor for more than 20 years on the Harvard faculty, if you've taught at Columbia University, if you've spent your time in Washington, this is the core idea. It's not a secret. And I present in this recent op-ed writings of one of the leading U.S. foreign policy experts inside the government, Ambassador Robert Blackwell, who says, yes, it is America's grand strategy to have dominance. Or people could read
Robert Kagan, who is at the Brookings Institution. He's the husband of our Undersecretary of State, Victoria Nuland. And read the book, The Return of the Jungle. The idea is the U.S. is the garden and the rest of the world is the jungle. And the only way that we're going to be safe is if the U.S. Dominates and holds back the jungle.
May I insert for that? Basically, you have to sometimes convert civilized states into jungles to be able to guard it. Is that right?
Well, what the U.S. foreign policy is based on, unlike all other countries almost, which use diplomacy, the U.S. uses regime change as its core instrument. In other words, typically in foreign policy, if you don't aim to be the dominant country of the world, when you're dealing with another country, you have a foreign policy based on diplomacy. With the United States, if you don't like the other country's government, you try to undermine it and overthrow it and replace it. There are literally dozens of US-led regime change operations. Sometimes they're quite visible. You invade Iraq. Sometimes they're not so clearly understood, as in 2011, when Obama and the US deep state, basically the security institutions, decided to overthrow Bashar al-Assad in Syria. There's a presidential finding ordering the CIA to cooperate with the regional powers to support the overthrow of Assad. That's diplomacy, quote unquote, US style. In 2011, the U.S. Led the NATO expedition to overthrow Gaddafi. In other words, don't do diplomacy, overthrow the government. In February 2014, and I think really Europeans should have a look at this, please. In February 2014, the United States actively participated in the overthrow of Ukraine's President Viktor Yanukovych. I happen to know a lot about that. I happen to have been there soon after the overthrow of Yanukovych. And
probably there's stuff you cannot divulge still.
And heard an earful. Europeans, please look at this. The war started in February 2014 with the U.S. role in the overthrow of Yanukovych. Okay, this is something that the U.S. and the European media don't want to say, they don't want to look at. It happens like so many times that inconveniently Russia caught Victoria Nuland on tape on February 6th, 2014. Yes. And it's as if that tape doesn't exist. There she is, 2 weeks before the government is stormed by a violent storm of from the streets, saying who the next government is going to be. And she describes who's going to be the next prime minister. This is 2 weeks before the storming of the government buildings. But like so many things, the idea of official secrecy is not to make anyone believe something necessarily, because these stories that the government tells are so unbelievable, but rather to get the media to state a story, believable or not, and to stick with it and not to look at the facts. This is our problem, really. So if you have a foreign policy that is based on global dominance and on regime change, first of all, you get into a lot of wars. The United States has been in a lot of wars. A lot of wars. These are wars of choice. Almost from Afghanistan, 1979, Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, Nicaragua, Iraq, Syria, Libya, and now Ukraine. But you need to be able to look at this a little bit, not like the official narrative, but to understand what are the motivations, what are the actual sequences of events that lead to this, what are the deeper causes, in other words, and then it becomes
rather decipherable, if I could put it that way. You can understand much better. And if people in Germany or in Europe say, oh, the government doesn't lie, the United States is filled relentlessly with state lying. Read the Pentagon Papers. Look at the Iraq War, 2003. Read Operation Timber Sycamore about the order to overthrow Assad. That's just the tip of the iceberg, but these are good, clear examples. This is what happens with state secrecy and with a foreign policy that's based on regime change. My basic point is it's dangerous, very dangerous. We could have had peace with Russia. Ukraine could have avoided this devastation had the United States not been pushing for hegemonic dominance in the Black Sea region. Why did NATO have to encircle Russia in the Black Sea? And I think it's important in Germany, especially, to remember that Hans Dietrich Genscher was very clear to President Gorbachev in 1990. NATO will not move to the east, not just to
1 inch.
GDR.
Not 1 inch was
exactly, not 1 inch eastward, but he meant clearly the east, and that means certainly not Ukraine and Georgia. It's the American idea. Are you kidding? We're going to move NATO to Georgia in the Caucasus? You can't think of anything more reckless. I can't think of anything more reckless. And here we are at war.
Professor Sachs, your time is very precious. It's short. What should Europe do? I mean, Europe is divided, and divide and conquer is an old imperial tactic, if I may say so. So what are your prescriptions for Europe?
My real prescription is understand the nature of this conflict. Understand its history, its roots. Understand that Europe's interest is not U.S. hegemony. This is very important. Europe's interests are peace, global cooperation, the UN Charter, good relations with the U.S., that's fine, but also normal relations with the rest of the world. And not, by the way, a new war in East Asia because the U.S. says so, because the big issue for U.S. hegemony right now is that China is a real competitor. And that's fine. It's 1.4 billion people trying to become prosperous like the rest of us. That's all this is.
If I may insert, you have also said that China could do. I mean, China lifted those people out of poverty. So it's a tremendous achievement. You said China could do a lot to help the world develop, and we should bring it into and use it, and then not confront it. So that's your view on China.
I've been going to China for 42 years, many times a year. I have students who are senior officials. I have friends. I have colleagues. I have watched China go from an impoverished country to a place of prosperity and a place of opportunity and a place of innovation. And I say, wonderful. Isn't that wonderful that after a century in which China was invaded by Britain, the Opium Wars, invaded, by the way, to force China to become addicted to British opium, invaded by other European powers, invaded by Japan, reduced to poverty, that China has recovered. Let's be friends. Come on, this isn't so hard. We don't need American hegemony. We need cooperation. We need peace. We need solving problems like climate change. We don't need the drumbeats of war everywhere. And Europe, of all places, should understand this.